Alrighty, we are all connected here, and it looks like we've kind of slowed down our trickle-in process. So Claire, if you are ready to get started, let's get underway.
Okay, the introduction. Alex Marzano-Lesnevich is an assistant professor at Bowdoin College in Portland, Maine. They have written essays and op-eds for various publications, including the New York Times, the Boston Globe, Oxford American, and Harper's, for which they wrote an essay titled Body Language that's included in the 2020 edition of the anthology, Best American Essays. But Alex is probably most well known for their groundbreaking, genre-defying, so good you won't be able to put it down, 2018 book, The Fact of a Body, A Murder and a Memoir, which delves simultaneously into the facts of a murder trial and Alex's own memories of childhood in a way that ultimately explores what it means to tell the truth and how complicated the truth can be. The Fact of a Body won a slew of awards upon its release, including a Lambda Literary Award and the Chautauqua Prize. And it was announced just a few weeks ago that the book is being adapted into a series by HBO. Alex's next book, Both and Neither, is a combined work of memoir, history, cultural analysis, trans reimaginings, and international road trip about life beyond the gender binary. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you so much, Claire. Thank you for that very thoughtful introduction. And thank you to you all for having me here. It's been so lovely to meet you all. I was so impressed both by the work that Claire and Jen turned in for workshop that we got to discuss earlier today, and also just by the comments that people made in workshop. A really beautiful discussion that emerged. So thank you for welcoming me into your little virtual community for tonight. It's really been quite beautiful. In the spirit of kind of the bravery that you are all showing in showing up to a program with your work in the middle of a global pandemic, making writing in the middle of a global pandemic, which I don't know, I have found challenging. I don't know how you all have found it. I thought that I would share something new that I made in the middle of this. So much as, in the course of figuring out what The Fact of a Body was about, I wrote a lot of shorter essays. To sort of figure out the size of the question that I would then explore in the book, because there were lots of questions that came up for me while I was working with its themes that actually suited an essay form better. And a lot of it was figuring out what belonged in the book and what belonged in an essay. And so to that end, as I work on Both and Neither, I find myself doing the same thing and writing these shorter essays. So I'm going to read something that I started really early in pandemia, as I've taken to calling this time, and kind of worked on and off. And then finally in December, it kind of clicked. And I finished it. I was printing it out to read to you guys. And I finished it, I guess, January 7th. So it is brand new. And it'll be out in Harvard Review, I think next month or the month after. But just really thank you again. It's really beautiful to spend this time with you all. Connection's hard to come by these days, I think, and gathering in a group is really nice. Okay, this is called Futurity. I will read as much as I can before the time. And the only thing that you need to know is the sections are numbered, and we're going to reach a point where I say skip. And that just means that on the page, the representation is like an M dash instead of a number. And it's like a placeholder for the number that isn't there. Okay. Futurity. 1. On a morning early in the second month of the unprecedented time, I rise to the sound of the birds and pad to the kitchen in my slippers. The air smells of hot coffee. Snow blankets the roof just outside the window, the light glinting off it, tracing swirls on the wall. I pour the coffee, roasty, familiar, constant. A few weeks ago, I would have carried the cup to my writing desk, there said a short prayer to the God of creation, pressed my pen to the page and tried to listen. But now I carry it to my bedroom where the curtains remain closed. I turn my bedside lamp on and open the novel on my nightstand. I will be in its world, not this one. 2. My jawline has become covered in blonde fuzz, and later, in front of the bathroom mirror, I see it backlit, the fuzz so pale it is visible only when struck by this light. I turned my head this way, then that, looking. The fuzz wasn't there a month ago. So much has changed. When my agent sends me notes on the latest writing I've been doing, he includes an instruction that I must search for mentions of my jawline. You mentioned the fuzz here and here and here, he says. He means we get the point. He means the mentions are getting old. But I've lived all my decades with a smooth jawline, and to me, none of this is old. I think of change constantly and the way change implies progression. And now, looking left and looking right, I wonder what I am seeing, what the fuzz is a harbinger of. Will it grow longer? Will I grow a beard? Or will it stay like this, so pale as to be nearly invisible, prepubescent even as time goes forward and inscribes lines on my skin? The future is as unknown to me as the changed world outside my window, the present like a scratch in one of the records my father used to play. 3. At the start of the shelter orders, a lover texted me that, fuck it, while we are all staying at home, they will grow in their soul patch. Shortly after we first met and I told them I was on testosterone, they looked at me in envy. I can't, my levels are too high, they said. I'll look too much like a man. I'm like you, I don't want to pass. But you, your body takes its time. You'll get to choose where you land. 4. This lover will come back up, so let's give them a name. Let's call them D. 5. When I wrote that I just met D, what I meant was that we had recognized something in each other on a dance floor. The floor almost empty, the music so loud as to hold all the space of the place, and our bodies had begun a silent communication, me moving this way and that, them coming closer and then further away. This was still, of course, in the before time. Disco lights looped the floor, some colored in ice blue. The beams cast like shadows had been shaped into snowflakes. Watching the swoop of the carved light, I imagined the sheets of colored polyethylene that had made it, that cool blue pressed to a burn like fire. The lights chased us and the music grew louder still, and I had grimaced or D had grimaced. They said something, but I didn't hear. I shook my head and they came in close, their mouths suddenly fitted over the shell of my ear. Want to find some quiet? I felt the sound lap in my ear canal warm. Then the cold slap of outside, the sudden grace of the dark, the stars above us so still. They pulled from their pocket a key. The key fitted the lock of their office, which turned out to be across the street. They knew where the security cameras were, the unlocked closet. Afterward, the two of us, a little punchy, maybe with drink and maybe with flush, we laughed at the irony of finding ourselves in a closet. We who have located whole lives, whole selves in the stepping out of closets. There was a small red light like in a dark room, and I remember using its dimness as cover to look at them, to really look. The hair, dark enough to be inky, clipped short as bristles. The jaw, square yet soft. Their shoulders, their breasts. They watched me look, the white of their eyes pink in the light, the mirrored black centers. Beads of sweat had formed on their upper lip. Tufts of hair gritted me from their armpits. Their sports bra, 2 sizes too small, had left angry raw marks over their soft chest. I looked at the hair under their arms. and the scores left by the flattening, and they looked at me and I knew what they were seeing in me too. Silence stretched into something sinewy enough to hold us. For the first time, I thought how alike were the words wrapped and wrapped. When they spoke, their voice scratched the edge of tears. I didn't know it would be so healing, they said. I've never been with someone else who... I don't think I let them finish, my mouth over theirs. 6. An incomplete list of things I have heard called queer about the pandemic. The surge in people making their own sourdough starter out of nothing more than flour and water and time. The rise in mask for mask jokes. Or, what does a lesbian bring to a second date? No, not a U-Haul, a COVID test. Or, U-Hauling as a responsible public health move. Cuffing season. Sex pods. The New York City Public Health Department recommending people, quote, make it a little kinky with gory holes. The rise in OnlyFans and Findom, which is to say the rise in sex work, thirst traps, sexting, phone sex, Zoom sex, FaceTime sex, sleeping with your roommates, spending the holidays with chosen family, the very fact of a pandemic, loss, grief, the impossibility of imagining a future. 7. Futurity, noun. Yes, all right, future time, the sense that there will be a future. The very thing that we are now all trying to hold on to as we wait for it to arrive. The projected shape that future makes. The shadow or light it casts over the present. But also, futurity, noun. A race for 2-year-old horses into which they are entered before they are born. 8. All right, as a metaphor for gender, maybe that's a little obvious. But also, futurities offer some of the richest prizes in horse racing. 9. From the windows of my study, I can see the largest hospital in Maine. By law, the ambulances must turn off their sirens this close. And so, periodically, when I look up from my desk now, 2 months into the at-home time, I see silent flashing lights. After a few days of this constant screaming silent alarm, and of the helicopters that land on the hospital roof at all hours, their thrum so loud as to consume me in the beat of metal wings, I write a prayer with a blue Sharpie onto a purple index card and thumbtack it to the wall between the 2 windows, right in my line of sight. May they be safe. May they be happy. May they be healthy. May they live with ease. 10. When we learn that men are dying at an exponentially higher rate than women from this virus, a friend asks me if I'll keep taking testosterone. I mutter something about how, well, I'm not going off a drug without medical advice, and my doctor has other things on her mind right now. That answer, I know, is bullshit. One of the purported benefits of the daily gel I use versus a weekly shot is that its progress is slow, and each day I must choose to apply it, must reaffirm my choice of who I am transforming to visibly be. I could choose no. What I really mean, but don't say, is that men have shorter life expectancies, more heart attacks, higher rates of dementia, and that I already knew all that. The trade-off did occur to me. But I do ask the doctor if I will lose my hair. That's what Rogaine's for, she says. It's not a reason not to live your life. Obviously, I want to live my life. I just like to live it with hair. 11. Here is how researchers say we slot one another into genders with a glance. The shape of a hairline, the shape of the eye socket, the ratio of hip to waist, the shape of the jawline, the shape of the chest. Clothing, hair length, manner of standing, where fat is distributed, quickness to smile. You can tell by the nose, the title of a 1995 study. We look for patterns. We look for what we know how to see. And I get that with the bodily factors, I'm talking about sex, not gender. But what I really am speaking of is how people perceive, the slotting, the conflation that happens the instant they perceive. That instant is what I keep thinking about. Just an instant, but in it, a whole narrative, my life, unfurls. 12. Imagine the horse's owner perusing the pages of racing magazines, loading websites late at night in an office tucked inside the pack room in a stable. The smell of sweat and dirt thick over the printouts of lineages that litter the desk. Perhaps there is a cup of coffee beside them. Perhaps a pregnant mare whinnies from down a long line of stalls, pacing before settling into her bed of hay. The owner sips from the coffee, clicks the mouse to scroll down the page, searches the list of the races in several years' time. You have pictured the owner either male or female, which doesn't matter. The owner is not the one we care about here, but which? Shadows pool around the blue light of the laptop. At the foal's birth, and then regularly thereafter, there will be fees to pay for each race in anticipation of when the horse will be ready. There must be a budget, calendars to be planned, a choice of projections in which to invest, the mapping out of finances and a life. 13. Imagine, too, that equine fetus, long limbs folded beneath it, not yet ready to run, tiny hooves still soft and shredded, not yet hardened by the pounding of movement. How now it rests and grows curled in the warm, wet womb for 11 months. The owner clicks and sips and allots money and decides which racing ovals will inscribe its future path, where bets will be placed, where its hardened hooves will someday run. I have a twin brother. We had a triplet sister, a sister in chromosomes at least. She would die too young for any of us to know anything about her, so here is what we knew. The blue eyes of a baby, tiny like us, and like us premature, girl. One of each, and me. 2 girls and a boy, the announcement. At 8, I became aware I wasn't a girl. 14. One of the first known people to use testosterone to alter his body was British 24-year-old Michael Dillon in 1939. He'd sought the treatment nominally for his menstrual periods, but already wore the clothing of a man. Before Dillon, men had grafted slices of chimpanzee testicles to their own. They had attached snippets taken from the genitals of goats. They had had the tubes that carried sperm from the testicles blocked, in the hopes that stopping its movement would create a surplus of vigor. Even William Butler Yeats underwent that surgery, hoping to keep up with a younger lover. Freud, too, and he demanded the doctor not disclose that until death. Dillon simply took pills. In writer Pagan Kennedy's account of his transformation, it is one way and absolute, and the hormone is what achieves and legitimizes it, upholding the sanctity of the binary. Of Dillon before he was Michael, Kennedy writes, "She became the first woman on record to take the drug with the intention of changing her sex." Then a sentence elapses, only a sentence. As soon as Dillon could look entirely male, he became invisible. 15. My writing seems to come out these days like my thoughts do, in snippets, disconnected, seized up. The thoughts can't adhere. I try to make a narrative line, but only these dots appear. Even Dee and I don't see each other anymore. I am alone in my apartment, no one to witness me or me them. We are all social distancing from one another. 16. We need a sense of what you want your body to look like, my agent writes. You tell us what feels wrong, what you want to change, but you don't tell us what you want to change to. He is asking me to imagine what comes after. 17. Levels of testosterone for those assigned female at birth generally stop at 60 or 70 nanograms per deciliter of blood. Levels for those assigned male at birth generally begin at 270 or 280 or 300. Note the vastness of the unnamed middle. When I began taking testosterone, my own levels fell very clearly on one side of the divide. Now I am caught in that middle, a sentence without knowledge of its end. 18. At times, I try to imagine what I want this country to look like when this is all over. I try to imagine us taking care of one another. I try to imagine my relatives and neighbors not reacting to the virus as though it is political. I try to imagine 343,593, today's count, tomorrow will be higher, people not dead, so many of them Black and brown, and so many of them economically marginalized. While I'm at it, I try to imagine Black men and women not killed by the police, immigrants not hunted at the border, a nation not founded on genocide, the erasure of the violences that make this place. 19. And okay, I try to imagine what I want to look like. But I grew up in the same damn binary everyone else did. The same damn America. 20. The truth is, I don't know how to answer my agent. It is easier for me to say what I don't want, harder to say what I do. 21. Queerness is not yet here. Queerness is an ideality. Put another way, we are not yet queer. We may never touch queerness, but we can feel it as the warm illumination of a horizon imbued with potentiality. We have never been queer, yet queerness exists for us as an ideality that can be distilled from the past and used to imagine a future. The future is queerness's domain, writes Jose Esteban Muñez. 22. There was a year once when I pricked myself 144 times with needles. I had known that my body could not cradle a baby, historically a mark of womanhood, but my body has always been made to fail that part, that to do so might endanger my life. I had assumed that there would be some future solution to this. Maybe a partner would carry, maybe science would catch up. A bit of regression to how I soothed myself to sleep when I was a child. No need to be afraid of death, for science would surely solve it before I grew old. My belief in science more potent than that in magic, any dream, any god. But I had aged, and the future had arrived, and there was no solution beyond pulling forth what was inside this body, my body. And so I went to doctors and had a probe inserted in myself, and I saw my own insides on the screen and the nascent beginnings of the material that would go into making another person. Every morning and every night, I drew clear liquid into a syringe and injected it to the ring of fat around my belly button, moving the needle clockwise to a new site, mimicking the march of time. My abdomen puffed. I grew nauseated, which seemed only fair. If my child would come into the world without me ever having morning sickness, shouldn't I be paying that debt forward now? 23. After each shot, I ate a cracker spread with the cheapest caviar, the kind you can get in the supermarket for $6 a jar. I had begun the ritual as a joke, a need to find joy and inject levity into the process, a need to disrupt how medicalized the whole thing was, how sterile, all those foreign objects I used to break my skin. We were trying to coax my body into such a high estrogen level it would release more eggs than the usual monthly one. I would, therefore, eat tiny eggs. Rhyming action, a move familiar to any writer. But what began as a joke was soon overcome by sensation. The smoothness of the hard little eggs between my palate and tongue, the salty pop as intense as the sea. The joke became a prayer, the taste as much benediction as tears. 24. The drug I injected myself with arrived by manila envelope from Israel, ordered off a spare website with a sketchy, straightforward name, 1-800-IVF-MEDS. In the United States, my dose might have cost me $1,000 every 2 days. From the website, more than a week could be had for that amount. The drug was precious, befitting its fairy tale origins, synthesized now, but once distilled from the urine of elderly cloistered Italian nuns. At their age, they had too much of the hormone needed to be pregnant. How infertility works, too much, not too little. The too muchness could be harvested, the wealth spread. Why nuns? Because the nuns had, presumably, not had sex, because they had, presumably, never seen their body reflected back in the body of another, because, presumably, there was no chance they could be pregnant. 25. Only writing this do I realize that my gay self would have been as safe a bet as those Italian nuns. Pretty funny. 26. One morning in the middle of the year of injections, I went to the doctor for a monitoring appointment. I did this a couple of times a week each cycle and had long since asked to insert the probe myself. A small bit of agency claimed. On the screen, black fuzz resolved itself into the shape of the follicles inside me, the spaces growing larger to shelter eggs. That afternoon, for a class I was taking, I went to a laboratory as sterile and white as the exam room I'd left. There, 5 dead bodies were laid out on slabs. 2 men, 3 women. I put on a plastic butcher's apron and clear plastic goggles and nitrile gloves, and my partner handed me a scalpel and pointed. I brought the blade to the body's fallopian tube. That's not quite right. I don't want to say the body, not doing something as intimate as slicing her up. But there you see the problem again. Her. I know nothing of this person, only the shape of their body. From this, I have deduced a pattern. I have no other word to choose. I don't know who she was beyond the mark of those ovaries. With my scalpel, I split them open, pale pink and the size of green cocktail olives. I saw the tiny hard eggs within, larger than a pinprick, a pencil point, the period of a sentence. Futures that had never been. 27. The drug worked. My body released eggs. Never many, but enough. These were injected with sperm, grown for several days, and then frozen. The cycle repeated once, twice, 3 times again. 28. Still, I waited. That fertilization had happened was no proof life could ever take root. It seemed likely I would be told it was all for naught. The child I had wanted since I was a child was not possible. It seemed impossible that I would get anything I wanted that much, as though the act of wanting made it impossible. Does everyone carry such felt knowledge of doom inside them, such belief in the impossibility of a future? Or only those of us born into bodies that cast us into a narrative that doesn't fit? As though having the audacity to want and to act on that want would itself be a trick, the coin proffered by a magician that vanishes with the opening of the hand that ought to reveal it. 29. So I remember the whoosh in my chest when, over the phone at the end of the year, I was finally told that some, 5, of the embryos were viable. How in that instant, a path opened to a door that opened to the future. 30. Maybe I only ever write about the problem of how to believe in the future. 31. I was ready to hang up then. I remember that too. I was awash in glee as though all at once the blood of my body had been rinsed in relief. The sensation was overwhelming, light-flooded, alive. I wanted to get off the phone, away from the doctor's voice, and just feel. 32. But she kept on. Of the 5, there's, she said, and told me the sex of the embryos. How many this kind? How many that? A clear favorite, not even odds, not at all. 33. The child in my daydreams acquired a gender. Skip. When I emerged from the restaurant where I'd taken the call, there was a child standing on the street, gripping a mother's hand. The mother, irrelevant to me, never what I would be. But that child, short blonde hair, striped shirt, a smudge on its cheek. It appeared to be of the gender that matched the sex I had just been told my someday child would likely be, and I remember how closely I observed it. I remember the feel of a daydream arranging itself, as though it were straightening its shirt hem, spitting into its palm, patting down its hair. Skip. And sure, I do my best to note in my daydreams now that a child's gender is not known just because their chromosomes are. Of that, I myself am proof. And really, even those chromosomes may turn out to be more complex as each embryo grows more than the 70 to 100 cells it has now. I know enough about sexology to know that the simplicity we've been bottle-fed is a lie, always has been a lie, that there are far more than 2 options and they are not as set as we might imagine. I do my best to imagine a doctor informing me of complexity. I do my best to imagine a child coming to me the way I eventually did to my parents. I do my best to imagine them speaking a truth about who they are and it not being the truth I expected. Or, conversely, the queer future of the unimaginable future, I do my best to think that perhaps they will be the most gender conforming kid around, and I'll have to wrap my mind around that. I do my best to hold space for every possibility. Skip, but I still can't imagine child without imagining gender. Skip, and what is a dream if not a narrative? Skip, and what is narrative if not constant foreclosure? This instead of that. Skip, what is the future if not the thing that replaces all other possible worlds? There are 16 more sections, but I'll stop there. Thank you, everybody. If anyone wants to chat, let's chat. I love questions.
Alrighty, everybody, you can feel free to type a message into the chat, and then we will, read it out, or you can just go on ahead and unmute yourself and ask.
I'll ask a question. Thanks, Alex. That was really beautiful. You mentioned before reading that it took a while to figure out what to do with the piece and where the piece was headed. And I guess I'm curious about how you decided to number each section and if that was part of what made everything click into place.
That's a great question, Claire. I'm kind of obsessed with structure because when I was in my own MFA program, I hated talking about structure. Like, I just hated it because I write like this. Even when I'm writing a continuous narrative, I absolutely write like that. I do not write linearly. And it took me a while to be like, okay, I better make a path for the reader. And it's kind of funny that I didn't like it because now I love it. And so I think it's right on my desk. It is. I was reading Jane Allison's Meander, Spiral, Explode, which is a book about structure I now love. And I was reading it with a mind to teaching from it, which I'm doing this term. But she was talking about spiral structures. And I gradually realized that I was writing, by the end of this piece, the narrator makes certain big changes and big decisions, and certain things come spiral full right back around. And I was writing at a moment where it was clear that we were coming to a point in the pandemic where it will soon be a year, right? And so the structure of the piece was mirroring that, that circularity, but that changed feeling of coming to the same place, but it's also different. Which amusingly enough is how I talk to my students about endings all the time. But I kind of realized that was a spiral. And then I realized that the IVF was like a tiny spiral in the middle of the piece. And I hadn't known that the piece was going to have IVF in it all. I just thought it was about testosterone and about the problem of imagining the future and the problem of doing a forward-looking act at a time when it's so hard to think about the future. Now, of course, in the way that the subconscious does with these things, I'm like, how on earth could I think that I was not going to end up writing about IVF in the middle of that? That's what that's about. But, I think our subconscious is pretty good about not revealing what we're writing about until we're deep inside it sometimes. Certainly, I thought The Fact of a Body was about something completely different. I'm sure this current book will reveal itself to be about something other than what I currently understand it to be. And so somewhere in there, I realized it was going to have that feel, and that I wanted the numbers to be withheld at a certain point. And if I wanted to make a feeling of the numbers being withheld, I had to have the numbers. So that did. And then I tried for a minute. There are 50 sections, and I was like, shouldn't it have 52? So it's a year. But you can't just add more stuff because you want to add more stuff. So no, it has 50, and I decided that was okay. Yeah. Thanks, Claire. Anybody else?
Hi, thank you again for the workshop. It was really, really useful and enlightening. As far as I read The Fact of a Body, and I know you talked about at the beginning of the workshop how some of it was essays, some of it was books, some of it was both in the end. I wondered, you touched on this briefly, but I wondered what kind of made that differentiation for you between something that where you were finally like, okay, this has to be an essay versus it has to be in the book.
Yeah, Jen, that's a great question. What did make the difference? So I revise in a way that will probably sound horrifying to everybody, which is that I must retype everything. Until I'm very far in, I have to retype the whole damn thing, start to finish. And that is probably because I write in such a nonlinear fashion. And it's almost like I have to reinvent the voice of the narrator. I'm constantly trying to get closer to what Vivian Gornick in the book, The Situation and the Story, which I know I referenced in our workshop earlier. It's because I'm obsessed with that book. I'm constantly trying to cue into the narrator's angle of vision, or what the narrator sees in the things that they're presenting, like why they're doing this anyway, how it is that they see things. And so for me, a big part of revision is figuring that out, is getting closer and closer and closer and more specific with that. And so as I get more specific with that and I understand more about who is this construct who is telling the book, which is like not the same as me, but is a construct invented for the purpose of delivering this book. As I understand that more, it becomes clear what is not what they need to tell the reader in order to bring them into this story. So that feel of where in life it's all connected and it's all related, but in the book, tragically, super tragically, because there's so many other things I would love to talk about in the course of the book is only about the one thing that it's about. So a really obvious example from The Fact of a Body is that there was a whole chapter about voir dire, juror selection, because I think juror selection is fascinating. And as a lawyer, like I think the whole case is decided in jury selection. And so there was a draft, and I have 2,000 pages of records for jury selection for that case. And it's all, I think, really interesting and chock full of like impactful stories. But in the actual book, The Fact of a Body, jury selection is a page and a half because like the reader just did not need that stuff, even though it was fascinating. And so that got pulled out a day, another day at the prison called Long-Termers Day became an essay. Lots of other things about the death penalty became an essay, because even though I care a lot about fights about the death penalty, I'm very, very anti-death penalty. That was actually sort of not what that book turned out to be about. That was not what that narrator was doing. And ditto with some stuff about trauma that became essays and just wasn't in the book. So for me, it's this constant, I wish I had like a more straightforward answer, but it really is like this, you know, I always say like you're making clay and you don't know yet whether it's going to be a rocket ship or a triceratops, because they both have a lot of triangles. And then only at some point are you like, oh, that's a tail. I guess it's a triceratops. I better get rid of that engine part that I don't know the name for, you know, better get rid of that thruster. So that constant refinement prospect, yeah. I would love for there to be a more efficient way to get there. I haven't found it yet, for me anyway. Like for me, outlines, I was talking about this with a friend today who has to write an outline for their new book. I wrote an outline, you know, I wrote a proposal, a 77-page proposal to sell Both and Neither. And I find it completely unuseful in writing the book, because in a way, I've just got to figure out what the structure of the actual text is. How about somebody else? Yeah,
It's someone else? Or
Josh, yeah, Josh.
Yeah, I had a question just about research and how you integrate that into your writing. I was struck by the details you included in your essay about the history of hormone therapy and also the listing of things deemed queer by the pandemic. That struck me as something you might encounter on like social media. And I would consider that research too. So I'm just curious to hear your views on research and writing.
Absolutely. One of my favorite topics, and I am teaching a class on that topic right now called The Art of Creative Research. Must highly recommend an essay by Philip Girard, which argues for 7 kinds of creative archives. It's in the back archives of the AWP Chronicle, the Writer's Chronicle. And it talks really broadly about the idea of the archive, and I was fortunate to encounter it pretty early on. I love research. I especially love research as like a stalling tactic. It's great. It's like feels productive, even though it just means I get to read shit and go places. So I kind of think about it as a stew. Behind me over there, you see the edge of 2 bookcases that are only books for both and neither. And I think I tend to read a lot of it and start to see what connects like this. You're absolutely right that the list of things called queer about the pandemic, I put out calls on Twitter and Instagram for people to tell me stuff that was queer about the pandemic. That's absolutely a form of research. Why not? And then other than that, I was reading a lot of books. Like I was reading a book about the history of testosterone because I thought it would be more about that. And I thought that would be useful for both and neither. Yeah, I think I like, okay, this is a side note, but this is, like I said, the way my brain works. Amanda Palmer of the Dresden Dolls, formerly the Dresden Dolls, currently of Amanda Palmer, the singer, if anyone knows her music. I once watched her give a talk where she was like, she said that the fundamental impulse of art for her is, have you ever noticed that this looks like this? And that really struck me because there's also a line in a novel by Martha Cooley called The Archivist that made a big impression on me, just utterly changed my life when I was in law school. I remember reading this line and being like, oh, that's what I'm supposed to do, which was a very inconvenient realization to have in law school. Existence is infinitely cross-referenced. With enough effort, anything can be shown to connect to anything else. I was like, I think that's what I'm interested in, how these things connect, how these very disparate things connect. And so for me, a lot of research has been just like stewing in whatever, just like absorbing as much as possible and looking for the off-kilter connections, like the less straightforward ones that start to appear. So for The Fact of a Body, I mean, that book was written off of 30,000 pages of court records I spent years tracking down. And I have these ridiculously exhaustive notebooks in which I just transcribed like what was happening. I would describe everything that was happening on every page of those court records. And I would keep marginalia of my emotional response. And I wasn't doing that initially because I thought I would use the marginalia of my emotional response. I was doing it because what I was reading was so upsetting that if I didn't record my emotional reaction, I wasn't able to keep going. So I had a place to just like jot down the emotional reaction, and that way I could keep going and just try to make myself into a transcription machine. And what happened was I spent so long with those records that the scenes started to feel real to me, like the images became very real to me. And I eventually realized that that was going to be my relationship to the research, where it was going to be less straightforward. Like there's all sorts of stuff that would have been important were I writing that in a purely journalistic way. But what was actually important in an artistic or creative way, not to draw a line between creativity and journalism, I don't believe in that line. I believe in literary journalism, absolutely. But what was going to be important in using it in a less straightforward fashion was the off-kilter parts, the parts that didn't quite belong, the connections that maybe weren't right-sized. One more reference for people thinking about that. In the amazing book Burning Down the House by Charles Baxter, which are a bunch of lectures on fiction, there is one lecture is called On Defamiliarization. And it talks about like the widowed image, the image that has come loose from the size it's supposed to be or from the narrative it's supposed to be part of. And it's like acquired this sticky specificity and additional meaning, which is I think often the way memory works. where sometimes the stray details are most important. Like for anyone who's read The Fact of a Body, there's a BB gun in the opening of that storyline that comes back later. But if you were a journalist talking about that case, that BB gun is not significant at all. But to me, I couldn't stop thinking about that BB gun. And so paying attention to like when the stray details become all sticky, that to me is a big part of quote unquote creative research, where you're letting things be the wrong size. I wish I could arrive at a more efficient way to get to all these things. You know, the only thing I've found for that is like become obsessed with it, spend years stewing in it, and pay attention to what haunts your dreams. The only thing I've figured out structurally for figuring out like what's an essay versus what's the book is like spend a lot of time retyping the whole thing. It's all terribly inefficient. If you find a more efficient way, please let me know. Another question? Didn't we have one over?
Oh,
Yeah.
I think it was just a few days ago, maybe even 10 days ago, that the New York state law, walking while trans, was repealed. And we recently in class read Flying While Trans, which was really great. I wonder if you could comment on the significance of the repeal, describe where your piece, your 2019 piece, Flying While Trans, if it was related and your mindset.
I don't know that, I'm sorry, if it was related to the repeal?
To the original state law, walking while trans.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. That's not, unfortunately, it's not my area of law. But I will say, I think we're seeing, for folks who are following all the court cases that are about to happen about about sports for trans kids, they're about to be like, it's just a slew of cases about that. And a lot of the laws that are currently on the books are pretty terrible. So I think we're going to see an enormous amount of case law over the next couple of years, an enormous amount of court fights. I will never forget being at the Creating Change conference, which is like when people talk about the gay agenda, like, haha, there's no gay agenda, except there kind of is, because there's the Creating Change conference, which exists to set the gay agenda. So I will never forget being at the Creating Change conference and watching Evan Wolfson, who was one of the architects of the legal fight for equal marriage, give a talk, and this was, you know, well before any of those laws came through, give a talk about how it wasn't going to be pride and it wasn't going to be sort of the more positive expressions of joy that brought about gay marriage. It was actually going to be divorces. It was actually going to be about the sheer number of people who got married in one state, moved to another state, and then tried to get divorced. And the law does not abide a patchwork solution. And that was going to turn out things. And I think about that all the time with my driver's license, which has me have one gender here and, you know, one gender, another gender the minute I cross a state line. So this isn't a direct answer to your question, to your comment, Julie, except to say that I don't think this current patchwork solution is going to abide for that long. I don't think it can. There are going to be too many legal fights. And so I think in like 3 years or so, you are going to see, that's how long it takes things to move through the system, pretty much. You're going to see a lot of fights, and we don't know which direction. I mean, I certainly hope it goes in what I consider the right direction, the direction that allows me and people I love to live as ourselves. But I think that you'll see more walking while trans laws repealed. You'll see more changes, but it's going to take time and fights.
I hope you keep writing about that. I hope.
Thank you. Yeah.
Keep writing as we see those changes and those shifts and the evolution.
I appreciate that. The book I'm working on, Both and Neither, goes back to the 1500s to talk about like the history of trans people. And one of the really funny things when I was selling it is people were like, but could you finish this now? Like, could this be due next year? Because we don't want this fight to be over. Like, isn't it going to be resolved in a year? And I was like, guys, that's adorable. I think we're still going to be having legal fights about this in like 3 years. People are still going to be talking about this. It's fine. So now it's due in 2022. Hopefully, the backbone of it is a giant road trip that starts in Albania with the Albanian Virgins. People may know about the Albanian Virgins, the oldest transmasculine community in Europe, in which it is deeply traditional to transition, deeply transitional, and goes from there into the present day. So it's like a nice small scope, like the 30,000 pages of The Fact of a Body. It's a nice small scope of hundreds of years. But the backbone is a big road trip that, of course, I wasn't able to do because of COVID this summer. So anyway, I will, in fact, thank you, Julie, keep writing about this. And hopefully I will finish this book.
That's great.
We'll see.
That's great. Thank you.
Anyone else?
I have another question, but someone can jump in. Okay, I'll go with it then. You mentioned jury duty earlier, and that just made me think about how much storytelling is involved with the legal system, which I mean is in your book, The Fact of a Body. But I wonder, apart from like everything that's chronicled in the book, just in your writing life now, I wonder if there's anything you learned from law school, studying law, that you've used as a writer, or that you use as a writer.
Oh, I love that. Thank you. Yeah, I think I look for systems. I think I look for the way that systems tell stories. I think I look for patterns, because the law is a set of patterns. It's a set of enforced patterns, but it's a, precedent in general is pattern. Yeah, I think that a big part of what happened with The Fact of a Body is that, before I was like a kind of naive kid headed to law school who really thought of, in a way that I think is impossible for us to think about now, but at the time, it seemed plausible maybe to think of a trial as a fact-finding exercise. And you can't make it through law school thinking critically without realizing that what it is like a story-making enterprise. And we call that story truth, or we call that story fact, but it's a narrative. Like the function of the law is to produce a narrative. And so that's where The Fact of a Body came from, is that I did not start off thinking that it was a book about how we tell stories about the past. I started off thinking that it was a book about obsession. I thought I was writing about the fact that I was obsessed with this case and that the lead defense attorney on the case was obsessed with it. It's funny what our subconscious lets us get away with thinking so that we can just feel safe and like, oh, I'm telling a story that doesn't have that too many stakes for me. And then, oof, you're inside of it and you're like, oh, now I know what this is about. Or I'm telling a story about the history of testosterone, nothing to do. Oh, shoot. I'm telling a story about how we believe in the future and whatever. Yeah. So, but I think looking for patterns was probably a big way it affected me. I'll tell you a way that it affected me that I had to undo, that did not help my writing, which is that when you're writing for law, you don't say anything unless you can say it 3 ways. And you do that. You say it over and over again, like 3-4 different ways in a legal brief. And I originally went to grad school for fiction. I switched while I was there once I sort of fell in love with creative nonfiction. But I remember showing up to fiction class and being like, oh, I can't say it 3 ways. That's boring and stalling the story. And they already know, shoot. So having to kind of undo that mode of writing and sort of trust my reader more and trust myself more as a storyteller. Thanks for that question. Any last question? I don't mean to call last if the time isn't up. I assumed we were an hour, but any other questions?
Alex, I have a quick question for you. Great. In terms of navigating that space that is a bit unknown and something that you are exploring yourself, in your day-to-day life, and then being asked to answer that on the page, as it's something that you're living and stuff. How do you try and navigate that in a sensical way? I guess I struggle to make it something that is comprehensible and is craft and writerly, if you will, right? So I'm curious how you kind of navigate that space as it's something that you're finding and experiencing on a day-to-day level as well.
Yeah, that's a great question, Luke. Thank you. Shitty first drafts, and a lot of them. For people who know that Anne Lamott chapter in Bird by Bird, I have yet to find a solution that is not just like, and now I will plunge myself towards at the irresolvability and write a lot of crappy sentences. And somewhere in there, my subconscious will actually spit up something true. So that way, and then also a fair amount of sheltering. So for example, I did not read to you guys From Both and Neither, because I read From Both and Neither in November and discovered that my subconscious was then like, and we are now not going to cough up words for a month because you broke the sacred compact that says that this shitty first draft is private. So I didn't, so now I, keep that compact a bit more and read something else, still something new, but read something else. Yeah, I think those are sort of the only ways. I believe very deeply in personal narrative as the genre of discovery, to quote Joseph Epstein, where you're kind of hurling yourself at something that is irresolvable, is like unresolved, is the central question. I think usually in memoir, that's where the narrative tension comes from, because most of us, thank God, like don't have lives that work on a narrative cliffhanger so much. Instead, we're hurling ourselves at what we're trying to figure out. And so I think of that as the obligation to the reader and the compact I'm creating with them, but it sure doesn't come out pretty at first. Like it just does not. So a lot of patience with that. Thanks for that question. Anybody else? Yeah.
How you had mentioned that you had started graduate school as a fiction and then decided to switch to nonfiction. Was it what you were just talking about, that self-discovery, that made you realize you were in the wrong genre? Like, what was that desire or reason to switch?
A couple of things. One, I read a book by Michael Gilmore called Shot in the Heart. Michael Gilmore was the brother of Gary Gilmore, who was the first person executed when the U.S. reinstated the death penalty in the 70s. You may know Norman Mailer's The Executioner Song, which is about Gary Gilmore. Side note, tangential side note, but so many people don't know this and it's everywhere, and I always feel like this is necessary to say. It's also where the Nike slogan, "Just Do It," came from. Those were Gary Gilmore's last words. He was executed by firing squad. He said, "Just do it," as his last words. And the copywriter for Nike was at his desk the next day and saw it in the paper and took that. So just do it. So I think the death penalty shows up in places we don't expect in the US. So I read Michael Gilmore's Shot in the Heart. That is a memoir of Gary, but it is really a reckoning with how does he understand the violence his brother committed, the murders his brother committed, but then also this very violent way his brother chose to be executed because he chose to be shot in the heart. And so I saw that, and it's not a straightforward memoir. It's like, I'm going to tell you the story of my family, so I have to go back to the history of Utah, and I have to take ghosts really literally. And there are ghosts operating as characters in the text. And I was like, what is this weird thing? Oh, this is creative nonfiction. Like it's a capacious genre. It's a really capacious genre. And so I got a little obsessed with that. And then also I was working on an academic book about the death penalty. I thought I was going to write a novel. And then I was going to write an academic book on the side, and I saw no reason I couldn't do both of these things simultaneously. Yeah, right. So they kind of collapsed into one book in a way, because I've never been very good at strictly academic writing that isn't interested in like these hauntings. I'm always interested in hauntings. I still write a lot of fiction. Nobody sees it. Someday they will, maybe, if I get up my nerves. But I think it's not a coincidence that I pretty much always, the kind of nonfiction I'm interested in the longer form always has kind of reimaginings. So in the book I'm working on now, there are characters from the archives who then come to literal life on the page and like join me and come hang out with me in a bar in Paris. So it's real, except of course that they died in, you know, the 1500s, and suddenly they're at La Mutinerie with me. So, so is that fiction? I don't know. I don't know. It's creative nonfiction. So that's why.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question. Anybody else? I have to tell you, you guys are like, this is delightful. You guys are asking great questions. Similar to the workshop earlier today where people were just making great comments and observations and discussions. Well, thank you.
Yeah, I think, yeah, we when I scheduled this, I forgot that Alex was on East Coast time. So it's 11:30 in Portland, Maine, and just as cold there as it is here. So this was fantastic. Thank you so much. I know that we're going to be talking about the things that you said in workshop for the rest of this year, and then probably next year too. So really, we appreciate it. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me. Don't worry, I made coffee earlier because I knew that we'd be doing this together. So yeah, thank you all. This is truly a delight and an honor. Thank you. Have a great rest of your class schedule and semester. Bye all. Thank you.
Awesome.